You know what I hate? I hate the terms antisocial and prosocial, and I'll tell you why. In the modern Western world, specifically the United States, the cultural disposition is a rejection of absolute value as a concept and a blanket push for tolerance. Every man decides what's true for him, there is no such thing as good or evil, we each exist in a bubble. Now, the reason I hate these terms is because these people are borrowing from my moral framework but trying to justify it with terms like antisocial. Antisocial as the antonym of prosocial, not to be confused with a wallflower or, me.
I'm just standing. Where is this gonna go? We already have a lot of shots like this.
Is defined by these four as behaviors which increase negative/harmful or decrease positive/beneficial outcomes for others. Outcomes can be material, physical, psychological, tangible, or intangible. Antisocial behaviors generally include acts that are against or interfere with others' goals, wants, or needs. I have an issue with this already by definition because it's outcome-based. You cannot define a thing by its effect, you must describe what it is. If I were to define a car as a machine which increases the speed at which I travel, that might be accurate, but it's insufficient to define a car. Similarly, while antisocial behaviors may have this effect, this hasn't told me what they actually are until the last sentence where it says, they generally include acts that are against others' goals, wants, or needs. I can of course be generous and take the final sentence as their whole definition and its inverse for prosocial as the complete definition, but it's worth pointing out nonetheless. No, my real issue is when this term is used in science, academia, and especially in education in place of value judgments. We don't say something is bad behavior, we say it's antisocial. One could argue that it's simply a name game, and I'd agree with you. However, it's important to understand the distinction, and more important, not to play the name game. To say behavior is bad is to appeal to a higher moral authority. For it to be bad, or a better term, evil, there must be an objective standard for good, and we must be obligated to strive for good and shy away from bad. By contrast, antisocial, while functionally they are still making a value judgment, is to remove any moral imperative from it. The behavior isn't wrong, evil, or bad, it's simply antisocial. And that means that there is nothing innately wrong with the behavior or person doing it, it simply is not what we do. Now, my contention is that the assertion that some behaviors are antisocial is in fact a veiled recognition of this moral absolute. Everyone seems to recognize, quite rightly, that little boys should not punch their sisters in the face. But to say that it is antisocial rather than simply wrong, immoral, or bad begs the question why being prosocial is to be preferred. If there's no absolute moral imperative directing behavior, then that means either a few are imposing their subjective morality on the many, or that there is something innately valuable about being prosocial. Either the one asserts that his own perspective, that we should exhibit prosocial behavior, should be adopted by others because he likes it, or he believes his assessment to be objectively and absolutely true. Basically, any assertion that behavior ought to be corrected is an implicit appeal to a higher morality. An appeal to pragmatism falls short because useful behavior begs the question, useful to who? And cannot ever fully justify why the individual should sacrifice his immediate happiness for the collective. So I was wondering why this might be happening, and I came up with a theory. My theory is that modern society, academia, and education in particular have bought into the patently silly idea that man is basically good, or to use their term, prosocial. So all of their findings and claims must be recontextualized to avoid confronting this contradiction. The contradiction, of course, is that, despite supposedly being innately good, we find that people are generally selfish, to the detriment of those around them, hence the need for correction. Now, if we simply acknowledge that man is predisposed to do evil and it is morally correct to steer him away from it, that solves the problem instantly. However, if you won't concede that, you're forced to find other explanations for this antisocial behavior. Explanations that leave the perpetrators of said behavior free from ethical responsibility. For instance, in this article from Families Rising, which offers advice on teaching pro-social behaviors, they assert that, if my son has missed thousands upon thousands of sensory-rich pro-socializing experiences, of course he will hit his little sister when she takes his toy. Reducing his behavior to merely trauma or simply a lack of education, as they do in this article, removes both agency and accountability and effectively dehumanizes its subject. By saying this, you have reduced this child to nothing but the product of his surroundings. His capacity to choose is discarded. The strategies offered in this article are literally training as you would a pet or a soldier. These are behavior modeling strategies. They will not empower the child or adult to recognize right from wrong or to choose pro-social behaviors because they are good and right. He will simply fall back on his basis level of training or, worse still, reject those constraints altogether when that outside influence is removed. The use of terms like prosocial and antisocial, then, comes from the constant shifting of terminology in order to avoid openly making value judgments. Take psychopathy, for instance. Psychopathy is not a diagnosis in the Diagnostic Standard Manual of Mental Disorders. Hallmarks of psychopathy include lack of empathy, dishonesty, and manipulative behavior. Psychopathy probably conjures pretty visceral images in your mind. However, that's not used in academia. They use a diagnosis called antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. Cleveland Clinic defines it as a mental health condition that causes harmful behaviors without remorse. When you say it this way, you're once again removing agency and moral responsibility for actions. The condition causes harmful behaviors. It's not the perpetrator's fault if he's a slave to the chemicals in his brain. This degradation of language should stop, and the people who assert there is a better way to live should be open and simply state that they believe their point of view to be objectively correct, and that some behaviors are simply wrong. And we should refuse to defer responsibility from the individual onto some nebulous disorder or trauma, and instead hold people accountable for their actions. That is all.